Greetings and welcome to some recordings for Anatomy and Physiology 2, Biology 112. We're talking about the digestive system, and we're in the third section of our discussion, Section C. This means we're looking today at some more anatomy of this digestive system. We're focusing on the large intestine, and then similar to the other sections, we're going to discuss the digestive process as well, going from the large intestine to the anus. Finally, in this section, we will discuss some homeostatic imbalances of this digestive system. As we can see, there's a picture of the digestive system. You can see that large intestine shown. Perhaps we should go to another slide that's a little bit more easy on the eyes and talk about how the large intestine is not about nutrient absorption. The large intestine is more so about absorption of water and vitamins. So here we have a diagram showing some features of the large intestine. Let's start off where we ended up at. Last section we ended up at the small intestine, and we left off at the ileocecal valve. So again, this valve is going to control the movement of contents into this large intestine. As we can see, the large intestine gets its name because of the diameter of the GI tract, unlike the small intestines, who have a much smaller diameter, but however, much longer in length. So we see three main sections to this large intestine. We see a ascending colon, and we see a transverse colon, and then coming to a descending colon, and moving into the sigmoid colon. The word sigmoid meaning S-shaped, so perhaps that's a helpful way to memorize that. Along the way, we'll talk about structures like the cecum and the vermiform appendix. We'll be pointing out smaller structures such as haustrum, and looking at features such as the rectum and anus. On the right, we see a closer look at the anus, and we're going to talk later on about structures within here. Basically, we're looking at a mixture of smooth muscle and skeletal muscle that's going to control the movement of unwanted contents. So again, on this diagram, we see many of the structures we discussed. Let's take a closer look at a few of these. One specific structure we see in the large intestines are the Taeniae coli. These are going to be longitudinal bundles of smooth muscle that bunch up kind of the large intestine into sacs called haustra. And perhaps we can see these haustra here, these pocket-like sacs. We also have epiploic appendages. These are going to be small filled pouches of visceral peritoneum. It is also noteworthy that the large intestine have no villi like the small intestines have. Instead, we have a smooth surface with some ridging. We do not have secretions of chemicals, but we have a secretion of mucus occurring in this large intestine. Here we look at some histology of the large intestine. We see comparison on this image, small intestine versus large intestine. Either way, we still have the four main layers of the GI tract, and we focus here on the mucosa layer. And in the mucosa layer of this GI tract, we have simple columnar epithelia, except for the anal region. And but we're going to have thick crypts, and these thick crypts are going to be what house the goblet cells, and the goblet cells produce the mucus that eases the passage of feces. Nearing the end of this rectum, we reach anal columns that are long folds in the anal canal with stratified squamous epithelium, that's shown in the lower right. And we're going to have two sphincters that control the release of feces. Notice that here we're involving some skeletal muscle that involves that release of material. We'll talk more about defecation later on in the digestive process. It is noteworthy that this large intestine houses a very diverse and very abundant flora of bacteria. Over 10 million discrete types of bacteria live in the large intestine. That means some do survive digestion, and some are able to move up and down and through the anus and populate this entire large intestine. There's a purpose for us housing this bacteria. And by the way, we might call this relationship a symbiotic relationship, whereas we give them housing, so to speak, and moisture and protection, and they help us do some things. So let's look at what they do for the human body. They're going to metabolize some host-derived molecules. They're going to ferment indigestible carbohydrates, and they can also, however, release some irritating acids sometimes, and in their activities they can also release a mixture of gases. Hence, that's where we get some gases that form. By the way, it is noteworthy, on the last slide we saw that the rectum has a rectal valve on it. That rectal valve does hold the contents of the feces in while letting gas to escape. Lastly, these bacteria produce vitamins for us, vitamin K and vitamin B. And again, this is one of the few substances that is absorbed in the large intestines. So in summary, we have a symbiotic relationship with bacteria. Their numbers are astounding. I've heard quotes that say that the number of bacteria living in the human body outnumber the total number of cells in the human body. So with the contents of the GI tract complete, we just wrapped up going from oral cavity to anus. And now we switch gears from that anatomy, and we're going to look at some digestive processes. And the last time in section B we talked about digestive processes, we were done with the small intestine. So here we are going from the end of the small intestine into the large intestine and exiting through the anus. So this is a continuation. So here we are continuing with step number 7 of the digestive process. What is left from this digestion is delivered to the large intestine via the ileocecal valve. So again, this material contains few nutrients because the small intestines should have absorbed most of those. It's going to spend about 12 to 24 hours in this large intestine. Again, we're going to have bacteria that are going to digest some leftover nutrients, and they're going to symbiotically provide us with vitamin K and vitamin B, and that does get absorbed through the wall. Water can also be reabsorbed through the large intestines, and keep in mind that we are also in effect drying out the feces as well. Lastly, we might absorb a little bit of sodium and a little bit of chloride as well. So we're going to have some mechanical digestion occurring and some chemical digestion occurring in this large intestine. So again, we have similar movements that moved material through the esophagus and the small intestines, etc. Well, here we have mechanical movements of the large intestine, including haustral churning, peristalsis, and mass peristalsis. So what's unique about this large intestine is the haustral churning. That is, the relaxed pouches are filled from below by muscular contractions. We'll also get a gastroileal reflex. That is, when the stomach is full, gastrin hormone relaxes the ileocecal sphincter so that the small intestine will empty and make room for more. Another reflex is the gastrocolic reflex. When the stomach fills, a strong peristaltic wave moves contents of the transverse colon into the rectum. And so, with having looked at mechanical digestion, now we look at chemical digestion in the large intestine. And again, we're we're throwing a wide variety of foodstuffs into this digestive system. Here we look specifically at carbohydrates, those carbohydrates. So we see the larger carbohydrates like starches can be broken down into simple sugars. And in this diagram, we see that we convert it to an intermediate molecule called pyruvate. And from there, we can break it down further and absorb some of the materials from this food, but some of it is retained as feces. Also notice the gases also are contained within the feces as well. So in terms of chemical digestion in the large intestines, there are no enzymes secreted. Again, just mucus from those goblet cells. These bacteria are going to ferment inside this region. So this is where we're going to get some of those unwanted gases that the human body sometimes produces. And as we discussed before, it's the bacteria that are producing the vitamin K and B in the colon. Another organ that we see along the way is the appendix. Here's a picture showing an appendicitis occurring. Sometimes this appendix does get inflamed, and that is a appendicitis. You might recall we talked about the appendix during the lymphatic system. That is because it is mainly in charge of lymphatic functions, keeping bacterial populations in check. One interesting idea about the appendix is that it acts as a sort of a bacterial reserve. It harbors good bacteria. So perhaps if there's a disease or a type of illness that moves through the large intestine, we still have that sort of reserve to come back to in the appendix. And then step 8 in this digestive process, after we pulled off some water from the material, after we have absorbed vitamins, we're ready for feces formation. These is going to take about 3 to 10 hours. We've removed about 90% of the water, and these feces are sort of semi-solid by the time they reach the transverse colon. One may be interested to ask, what is exactly in feces? Well, its color is retained from certain molecules, such as bilirubin, getting turned into simpler substances that produce color. And the feces also contain dead epithelial cells. And in addition, cellulose, which is a plant material, fiber in other words, cannot be digested. So that's going to largely be contained within feces as well. Lastly, some bacteria, both live and dead, are eliminated as well. So the last step we come to in this digestive process is defecation, also called elimination as well. The elimination of feces is a reflex reaction, and that's going to be aided by some voluntary contractions of the diaphragm and the abdominal muscles. Perhaps one might notice some of those muscles contracting when doing elimination. Remember that we have two sphincters in this region. We have an internal anal sphincter, and parasympathetic nerves are going to contract muscles of the rectum and also relax the internal anal sphincter. So that's going to help with movement. Secondly, also, we get an external sphincter. That is skeletal muscle that's going to control that, and so therefore that is voluntarily controlled. Perhaps maybe a homeostatic imbalance of this defecation process is diarrhea and constipation. So we'll start that constipation is a temporary but impaired ability to defecate, and generally results in compacted feces that are difficult to eliminate. That means too much water has been reabsorbed. So how can we remedy that? We can have a high fiber diet to remedy that, increase exercise that will help reduce constipation, and drink much water to combat constipation. On the other side of things, we have diarrhea. Diarrhea is chyme that passes too quickly through the intestine. And so this could be a result from failure of the large intestine to absorb water, or maybe to form excessive amounts of osmotically active solutes that keep water in that intestinal lumen. So in summary, defecation is elimination of substances that the human body cannot extract material out of. And that, for the most part, wraps up the digestive system. From here on out, we look at some tangential ideas that relate to the digestive system. And one application is this idea of fiber. As we mentioned before, one of the materials eliminated from the human body is cellulose, and cellulose is plant material, and so this plant material cannot be broken down by the human body. But this is good. We have two types of fiber that both speed up food passage through the GI tract. We have insoluble fiber. That's going to be the woody parts of plants. These have a good feature of protecting possibly against colon cancer. And then we have soluble fiber, beans, oats, citrus, etc. This is going to lower blood cholesterol. Some persons are interested in viewing the contents of their colon. So a colonoscopy is the visual examination of the lining of the colon. And they're going to be using a long, flexible fiber optic endoscope to observe the interior lumen of the gastrointestinal tract. Here are a few slides that act as a nice overall summary for the system, and then also some of the discussions we've had. Perhaps it's a good idea to push pause here or there on the YouTube video and read through these and make sure you feel comfortable with some of these concepts. Well, we reach the final part of section C, and that is where we talk about homeostatic imbalances of the digestive system. And we start with aging is one possible homeostatic imbalance. As we age, our secretory mechanisms are reduced. So we have less juices and chemicals produced in the GI tract. Decreased motility, so there's peristaltic waves and haustral churning and segmentation become less pronounced. Some of that muscular tissue that moves through the digestive tract loses strength. And also we have changes in neurosensory feedback, diminished response to pain as well. So we see that aging is not very graceful on the digestive systems. So we're going to have a variety of symptoms that are going to happen from this aging, and sometimes the cancer of the colon or rectum is common. That's why screenings for these cancers are recommended in increased frequency as a person ages. Another homeostatic imbalance is periodontal disease. That's going to be inflammation and degeneration of the gingivae, the gums around the teeth, that is. Also, the alveolar bone can be affected, as well as the periodontal ligaments as well. Tooth decay results from acid-producing bacteria that reside on the dental plaque, and they act on sugars. So that's why the dentists always tell us to avoid sugary materials. That's because that acidity is going to demineralize the tooth enamel and the dentin within the acid. Let's go ahead and get off this slide and quickly get to perhaps another one. We move on to peptic ulcers. These peptic ulcers are going to be crater-like lesions that develop in the mucous membrane of the GI tract. As we can see from the images below, we see peptic ulcers. Notice that they are usually solitary in their presence. And so we see a slight difference between the two. Overall, a peptic is a chronic erosion of the lining of the stomach or the duodenum. Gastric ulcers are going to be peptic ulcers that occur in the stomach, And then duodenal ulcers are peptic ulcers that occur in the duodenum. The symptoms of an ulcer include a gnawing, sort of burning pain in the epigastric region. We might also get nausea, vomiting, extreme belching, and tar-like stools. If we do not treat these ulcers, it might leave a perforation in the GI tract wall, and this is going to be a medical emergency. Some possible causes of these ulcers include bacterium. The Heliobacter pylori bacterium is present in 70% of gastric ulcers and 90% of duodenal ulcers, which erode the stomach lining. How can we treat this? Possibly with things like antibiotics, antacids, proton pump inhibitors, and histamine blockers. Another homeostatic imbalance is diverticulosis and diverticulitis. So let's start off with diverticula. These are going to be sac-like outpouchings of the wall of the colon, and that's going to happen where places where muscularis has become weak. So with these diverticula, this is going to be generally formed in response to low amounts of bulk in the colon. And then diverticulitis is inflammation of those diverticula, and these might be life-threatening in case of a rupture. How can we relieve ourselves? We can take a high-fiber diet that's going to help relieve these symptoms. And here is a slide defining the differences in hepatitis. In general, hepatitis is an inflammation of the liver, and that's going to be caused by viruses or drugs or chemicals, and including alcohol is a drug as well. These have different types of prevalence and different types of severity. The more common one is hepatitis A. That's also called infectious hepatitis. That's caused by a virus and is spread by fecal contamination. That's why people often are required in food industry to wash their hands frequently. It does not cause lasting liver damage, and it can be treated. Hepatitis B is a little bit more concerning. That is caused by the hepatitis B virus and is spread primarily by sexual contact. There are vaccines available to prevent hepatitis B infection. And then we have the more serious hepatitis C virus. It is clinically similar to the hepatitis B, but this is often spread by blood transfusions. This can lead to liver damage, including cirrhosis of the liver and possibly liver cancer. And then the less prevalent are hepatitis D and E. These are related to other hepatitis syndromes. Lastly, we wrap up with the digestive system with another homeostatic imbalance, and that is anorexia nervosa. This might be considered a borderline on the psychology and psychotherapy realm. This is going to be characterized by self-induced weight loss, body image, and perceptual disturbances. Physiological changes can result from nutritional depletion. In other words, a person is going to be very emaciated or skinny from anorexia. These individuals may become so emaciated that they ultimately die, and there could be lifelong complications that occur from this severe weight loss. Some treatment for anorexia includes psychotherapy and dietary regulation. So that concludes section C, digestive system. Next section, we're going to move on to nutrition, our last and final section of this series.